Hello, my friends. Let me walk you through what's really being floated right now in this Russia-Ukraine endgame, because the sheer audacity of some of these Western ideas tells you more about where the war is headed than any press conference does. European officials are out there repeating the ritual line that they want a just, lasting peace, but then in the next breath, they admit they've heard no concessions from Russia and still frame this as one aggressor, one victim. That's not diplomacy. That's propaganda, and it explains why every Western peace proposal so far collapses on contact with reality. Now we're told the Trump team is entertaining a plan to lease Donbass to Russia, with Kyiv keeping legal ownership while Moscow pays some kind of rental fee. I'll be honest, I didn't see that one coming because it's so detached from the battlefield that you almost have to laugh to keep from shaking your head. Russia already controls about 90% of Donbass. Under this scheme, Moscow would be paying for territory it already holds, including the remaining sliver it hasn't even taken yet, and Putin would be expected to go before the Russian public and announce, "We won, and now we're paying rent." Politically, that's a non-starter. It's as absurd as imagining Zelensky telling Ukrainians, "We're surrendering more land because someone in Washington cooked up a business school workaround." Wars don't end that way, and this war certainly won't, because Russia isn't fighting an optional expeditionary adventure. It's fighting what it sees as an existential security war on its border. And you don't barter existential security for a lease payment and a photo op. The only reason this lease idea appears at all is money. The West knows Ukraine is economically shredded, and they're hunting for any mechanism to keep Kiev afloat without admitting defeat. But if there's ever going to be Russian participation in rebuilding Ukraine, it won't be through a humiliating rent framework, and it won't be while the West keeps arming Ukraine as a forward military platform. Trust between Russia and the collective West has been smashed to pieces. Restoring it would take a generation, maybe more, and only if the West stops treating every pause in fighting as a chance to reload the gun. And that's why the EU's so-called two-point peace plan is revealing in its own way. What they call a plan is simply weaken Russia and support Ukraine. That isn't peace. It's a slogan for indefinite war. Weaken Russia has no measurable endpoint. It's just code for regime change fantasies that died on the battlefield but still haunt Brussels. Meanwhile, another part of the Trump draft being discussed would offer Ukraine an Article 5-style security guarantee in exchange for conceding territory and freezing the lines in places like Kherson and Zaporizhia. Read that carefully. A NATO-like mutual defense pledge for Ukraine is, in Moscow's eyes, NATO membership by another name. It's the very red line Russia went to war to stop. The West tries to sell it as a deterrent, but everyone should recognize the trap inside it. If you declare that any future Russian incursion automatically threatens the entire transatlantic community, you're baking a Russia-NATO war into the future. Yet the West has had zero appetite to fight Russia directly for 4 years. So why would Moscow sign a deal whose logic ends with a confrontation the West itself doesn't have the stomach for, especially when Russia is advancing on the ground? Speaking of that battlefield reality, Russian forces continue to push across multiple sectors, and even when Ukraine denies the fall of a city like Kupiansk, that denial doesn't change the strategic picture. Russia's moving forward, thinning Ukraine's lines, and stacking leverage with every kilometer gained. So ask yourself the obvious question the Western commentariat avoids. Why would Russia agree to pay for de facto control of Donbass when it already has de facto control and is steadily turning it into de jure control through military success? It wouldn't, unless Russia believed the West had fundamentally changed its posture, and nothing in Brussels or Washington suggests that. That's why you see the familiar pattern of scare stories suddenly erupting right when talks are even whispered. Headlines about Russia testing Article 5 or preparing to attack NATO conveniently appear on cue, not because Moscow is about to do something irrational, but because Western hardliners need fear to smother diplomacy before it takes root. They want publics primed to reject any settlement that acknowledges Russian gains or Russian security demands. But here's the reality. Russia doesn't need theater. It needs guarantees that Ukraine won't be rebuilt as a NATO spear point. And it needs a settlement that reflects the facts on the ground. The West can keep pretending slogans or strategy and can keep floating glossy business model fixes like leases and security guarantees that are NATO membership in disguise, but none of that changes the core equation. This war is ending on Russian terms because Russia is winning the war that matters, the one on the ground, and no amount of diplomatic wordplay will reverse that. The only question left is how long the West keeps Ukraine in the grinder before admitting what the battlefield has been saying for a long time. Let me pick this up and lay it out plainly, because the last 24 hours have been unusually dramatic, and they've thrown the whole Ukraine track back into flux. What we're watching is the slow, reluctant return of Washington to reality after weeks of illusion, and the trail of leaks, resignations, and panicked European noise is basically confirmation that something serious is being negotiated behind closed doors. Since yesterday, more detail has spilled out about a peace document being worked on by Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev. And the key point is not that it exists, but that it's being drafted jointly by Russians and Americans, which means the Alaska understanding is no longer just a memory or a rumor, it's being reduced to paper. There was reportedly a post by Witkoff on X saying the U.S. never intended to disclose the talks, but the plan got leaked anyway, and the fingerprints point toward General Keith Kellogg, who clearly doesn't support what's now being negotiated. Shortly after the leaks, word spread in Washington that Kellogg is furious and intends to step down when his term as Trump's Ukraine negotiator expires in January. Whether he leaked to Axios, The Economist, or the Financial Times, we can't know for sure. But the sequence makes sense. Kellogg pushes a freeze on the lines model that Russia has already rejected, realizes the White House is moving back toward the Alaska track, and decides to exit rather than be the public face of a settlement he hates. So what do we know about the document itself? First, it's unfinished. There are still competing formulations inside it, which is why the reporting looks contradictory. But the spine of it is clear. This is Istanbul Plus, meaning the 2022 framework, upgraded and hardened in Russia's favor because the battlefield has moved and time has proven Moscow right about the war's root causes. I think this document is the formal follow-up to Witkoff's August discussions with Putin and to the verbal understanding Trump and Putin reached in Alaska. The Russians have been waiting for Washington to come back with a considered written response to those Alaska terms, and their patience wore thin when Trump floated tomahawks for Ukraine and then tilted back toward Zelensky's freeze plan. Lavrov made Russia's displeasure unambiguous. Trump called Putin before meeting Zelensky, and he hoped to drag Zelensky toward the Alaska consensus, but that meeting went sideways. Zelensky pushed back, voices rose, Trump literally tossed aside Zelensky's maps, and in the end, Trump wobbled and temporarily reverted to the Kellogg freeze idea. Then we got weeks of Washington retilting to Kiev, sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, and the cancellation of Trump's proposed Budapest summit with Putin. That phase is now over because it led nowhere. Someone in Trump's circle has convinced him again that Russia is not bending, that the Donbass front is not stable, and that Ukraine is on the edge of a real collapse. Dmitriev's Washington visit 2 weeks ago seems to have been a trigger point. Even if it started cold, contacts resumed, and now Witkoff, Dmitriev, Vance, Rubio, and possibly Kushner are trying to iron out a real text. This is a turning point in any negotiation. Once you're drafting a shared document, you're no longer in vague verbal territory. You're crystallizing commitments into language that can be shown to third parties. That step alone tells you there is a U.S. Russia consensus forming, whatever Zelensky or Brussels wants to pretend. Now, what's inside? We don't have the paper, but multiple streams align on several pillars. Ukraine's neutral status is central. No NATO membership. Not now, not later. If you see claims that NATO membership is merely paused, that's almost certainly Kellogg's spin, because Russia would never accept a pause that can be reversed. The structure of security guarantees looks like Istanbul guarantees for Ukraine that fall far short of NATO. Article 5, balanced by guarantees for Russia that NATO expansion stops adding military pressure on Russia's border. On demilitarization, the numbers being floated vary, but the direction is the same. Ukraine's army is to be cut dramatically, whether halved or reduced by 2.5 times. You're talking about taking Kiev from a million-man war posture down to a force that can't threaten Russia. Ukraine would surrender long-range strike capability, missiles and drones capable of deep hits into Russian territory, and U.S. weapons deliveries would stop. There is also a hard ban on foreign troops in Ukraine after a settlement. No coalition of the willing, no Macron-Starmer expedition, no NATO footprint under any label. And this is where Europe is losing its mind, because it kills their fantasy that they can keep Ukraine as a forward base while calling it peacekeeping. Culturally and politically, the draft appears to go even further than the original Istanbul text. Russian is to become a state language again, implying equal legal standing with Ukrainian. That is a seismic shift, and it effectively ends the Maidan project as a linguistic purge. It matches what's already happening socially, where Russian is reasserting itself among youth, workplaces, and even inside the Ukrainian army, despite official repression. Alongside that, the Orthodox Church is to regain its legal status, and anyone who understands Ukraine knows this, re-anchors the country to its historical and cultural reality, which Kiev tried to sever by force. Those provisions are not minority rights footnotes. They are structural corrections to the anti-Russian identity experiment that has been imposed since 2014. On territory, Donbass is the anchor, Ukraine withdraws fully, and the U.S. is expected to recognize Crimea, Lugansk, and Donetsk as Russian. Kyiv won't be forced to recognize it immediately, but Washington doing so is already an enormous geopolitical concession to facts on the ground. The idea that Russia would lease territory or pay rent is nonsense and will die in committee, because once the U.S. recognizes those regions as Russian, there's nothing to rent. As for Kherson and Zaporizhia, some language about freezing lines may remain for the moment, but Lavrov has already said the U.S. admitted it cannot ignore the referendum results in Russia's 5 historical regions. From Moscow's perspective, any temporary freeze is transitional, and once the political and military balance shifts under this settlement, smaller Ukrainian army, no NATO path, Russian language restored, Donbass secured, Kiev will not have the capacity to resist the eventual transfer of Kherson and Zaporizhia as well. So why is Trump snapping back to Alaska terms now after flirting with Kellogg's freeze plan? One word, the front. The fairy tale that Ukraine was holding its own has collapsed. Western intelligence, whatever European politicians say in public, knows the real casualty levels and the degraded state of Ukrainian forces. Even Russia's SVR is reporting that Western agencies are telling their governments the anti-Russia project is failing. Trump may not have been told everything earlier. The bureaucracy shields presidents from bad news when it suits institutional agendas, but the truth is now unavoidable. If the war continues, Russia will take the rest of Donbass outright, and Kiev's leverage vanishes, leaving Russia free to demand even harsher terms, Kharkov-Dnipro corridors, deeper strategic buffers, or to refuse diplomacy entirely. Add to that the collapse of U.S. economic leverage. China will not cut off Russia, and Washington has discovered that in any economic trench war with Beijing, China holds the industrial high ground, including rare earth choke points. India continues buying Russian oil at scale despite American pressure, and sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil are sending shockwaves through global energy markets, including rising diesel prices inside the United States, which matters politically when Republicans are taking election hits. So Trump is being forced back to a settlement track that reflects the only real power on the chessboard right now, Russian battlefield momentum. Now, will Kyiv accept this? No. Zelensky has already rejected it. Reports of a Witkoff-Zelensky meeting in Istanbul turned into a humiliation for Zelensky. He rushed to Turkey hoping to sell a Kellogg-style freeze and European troop presence. Witkoff refused to meet Yermak and demanded Zelensky directly, then canceled once he realized Zelensky was bringing a non-starter for Moscow. Zelensky went home empty-handed, The Europeans will reject it too, because it's a strategic defeat. No NATO Ukraine, no EU-driven military protectorate, US recognition of Russian gains, and a wider security architecture discussion that shifts Europe out of its comfort zone. France is already calling it capitulation. Kaja Kallas and the Brussels machine are lining up to sabotage it, and every one of them is clinging to the fantasy of a settlement on Western terms. Even Zelensky's domestic rivals in Kiev, Poroshenko, Klitschko, Tymoshenko, Zaluzhny, will reject it, because no Ukrainian politician can survive signing a deal that rewrites Ukraine's identity, shrinks its army, and admits the war was lost. That's why theories that NABU, SAPO corruption probes are a US or EU tool to remove Zelensky miss the point. There is no more compliant replacement available. What's really happening is a power struggle among Ukrainian elites, and Europe has moved to shore Zelensky up because they need a stable war manager in Kyiv, not a destabilized regime at the exact moment they're trying to block the US-Russia draft. So expect Kiev's elite to rally around Zelensky temporarily, not because they love him, but because they need him as the spearhead against this Witkoff-Dmitriev plan. They'd rather keep the money flowing and lose the war slowly than accept a settlement that ends their project and sidelines them politically. That in turn makes the draft effectively stillborn unless Washington is willing to walk away. And here's the hard truth. Trump has hit this junction before, and his historical pattern is to get cold feet, listen to neocons, and drift back toward Ukraine. Kellogg exiting might reduce that pull, but betting on Trump's resolve here is hope over experience. Strategically, though, what Trump does now mostly affects the length of the war, not its outcome. With Ukraine and Europe rejecting the only deal Russia would consider, the path leads back to the battlefield, and that battlefield is already tilting decisively toward a Russian victory. You can see it in the scale of Russia's latest missile and drone strikes, more concentrated, more precise, less impeded by air defense, and you can see it in the continuing advances across key sectors from Zaporizhia to the urban belts that anchor Ukraine's remaining defense. I'll go deeper on the operational picture next, but for now, the political bottom line is simple. The U.S. and Russia are drafting the structure of a settlement that reflects Russian success and Russian security demands. Kiev and Brussels are preparing to torpedo it. And unless Washington finally accepts that Europe is the obstacle and cuts the cord, the war will grind forward until Russia imposes its terms by force anyway. We're looking at a rapidly evolving situation where Western officials are openly admitting, almost by accident, that Europe and Kiev were never part of drafting the latest US-Russia peace framework. And that tells you everything about who actually has leverage. Kaja Kallas has been out there repeating the familiar line that there is one aggressor and one victim, and complaining that Russia hasn't offered concessions, but that's political theater. The reality is that Europe has no seat at the table because Europe is not the decisive actor in this war. It's been a secondary instrument of Washington's Ukraine project. And now Washington is negotiating directly with Moscow because Washington knows where power sits. The mainstream Western press is framing renewed Witkoff-Dmitriev talks as a return to Alaska, meaning a return to what Trump and Putin verbally agreed before Trump walked it back under pressure from hawks in his own camp. Lavrov has been clear about that sequence for months. Trump accepted a set of Russian-aligned realities. Then advisors Kellogg, Lindsey Graham types, financial hardliners, and probably Rubio sold him a fairy tale about a stalemate on the battlefield and imminent Russian economic collapse. If only the U.S. turned the sanctions screw a little harder. So Trump reversed course, escalated the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, flirted with Tomahawk deployments and long-range strikes, and tried to launder weapons through NATO so he could pretend the U.S. wasn't directly fueling the fire. But 4 years into this war, the battlefield has demolished that narrative. Russia is advancing across multiple sectors, taking ground in Donetsk, pushing in Zaporizhia, tightening the vice around key urban nodes and forcing Kyiv into a defensive posture it no longer has the manpower or equipment to sustain. That military momentum, not speeches in Brussels, is what has dragged Trump back to the Alaska track. It's why Witkoff and Dmitriev are the ones talking now, because they're the two interlocutors who can operate in the space of reality rather than propaganda. Russian media has stayed disciplined and quiet about details, while the collective West leaks bullet points nonstop, partly to sabotage the talks, and partly because they can't resist shaping a preemptive narrative for domestic audiences. Financial Times, NBC, and Axios are all pointing to the same core fact. Trump has greenlit a framework with Moscow, and Europe is frozen out. That humiliates Brussels because it exposes what this war always was, an American proxy conflict with Europe paying the bill and Ukraine paying in blood. So Callas makes noise about no negotiations without Ukraine and the EU, but that's like a passenger demanding to steer a plane after the pilot has already decided the route. You don't invite vassals to negotiate the strategy of a war they never controlled. Now, the leaks themselves have been revealing. One absurd idea floated in the UK Telegraph was a lease arrangement for Donbass. Russia pays rent to Ukraine while controlling the region. That is not a serious proposal. It's Western spin meant to dress up capitulation as a business deal. If there is anything like that in the draft, it will die instantly because it contradicts the core logic of Russia's position and the facts on the ground. Russia already controls most of Donbass by force of arms and by referenda. It is not going to pay rent for what it considers sovereign Russian territory, especially not after absorbing 4 years of sanctions and battlefield costs to secure it. More credible reporting, again, still leaks, but more aligned with Russian red lines, says Washington is prepared to recognize Crimea as Russian, acknowledge the Donbass reality, restore Russian language and Orthodox church rights inside what remains of Ukraine, slash the Ukrainian military to a fraction of its current size, ban foreign troop deployments, end Western delivery of deep strike weapons, and freeze parts of the line temporarily in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Those points line up with Istanbul Plus, with root cause security demands that Moscow has repeated since 2022 and reinforced in June 2024. The Economist is even signaling that Ukraine's force could be reduced not merely by half, but by something like 2.5 times essentially formal demilitarization. And here's the part Western media is being deliberately dishonest about. They're calling Ukraine's loss of Donetsk a concession. It's not a concession, it's an inevitability. That territory is going to fall militarily in the near term anyway, and everyone in any serious intelligence service knows it. The West is trying to sell the unavoidable as a voluntary sacrifice so they can pretend Kyiv has bargaining power it no longer possesses. The same applies to the front around Seversk. Even Ukrainian mapping channels now confirm Russian assault units are in the city center, Ukrainian logistics are cut, and the collapse of that pocket is a matter of time, not speculation. This is the engine driving diplomacy. If Russia were stuck, there would be no Alaska revival. The only reason Trump is circling back is because the U.S. NATO position in Ukraine is failing in broad daylight. That also explains why Reuters reports Kellogg is leaving in January. If true, that's not a footnote. It's a signal that the hardline freeze then rearm faction inside Trump's orbit is losing ground to the realists who understand the war's trajectory. But let me be blunt. Even if Washington wants to formalize an Alaska-style settlement, Zelensky is not going to accept it, and neither are the Europeans. Zelensky rejected the outline as soon as it was presented. Public smiles don't matter, because his political survival depends on continuing the war, not ending it on terms that expose Maidan as a geopolitical dead end. Europe will reject it because it represents a Russian victory and a European strategic humiliation. The Europeans have already started lining up their 3 escape hatches. Keep funding Kiev directly, mutualize loans to carry the cost forward, or seize frozen Russian assets and pretend it's reparations. Von der Leyen is pushing those ideas hard because Brussels is ideologically invested in not admitting defeat. Orban, meanwhile, is openly calling this what it is, a plan to prolong an unwinnable war. paid for by Europeans who were never asked if they wanted it, and who will suffer the blowback for decades. He's warning that seizing Russian assets risks lawsuits, legal chaos, and serious damage to the euro's credibility, because a currency bloc that normalizes confiscation is a bloc the world stops trusting. Strip away the rhetoric, and that fight inside Europe boils down to one thing. The EU leadership knows the war is lost, but they want to drag it out rather than accept a settlement authored in Moscow and Washington. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us exactly where the battlefield has been pointing for months. The so-called peace framework will be rejected by Kiev and sabotaged by Brussels, and unless Trump truly walks away, something he has failed to do repeatedly in the past, the war continues until Russia completes its objectives on the ground. The difference now is that even Washington is inching toward acknowledging that outcome, because you can't keep selling a fantasy when Russian forces are advancing, Ukrainian manpower is collapsing, and Western leverage, military, economic, and political, is evaporating. That is the story of this week, and that is why the Alaska track is back. Not because Europe wants it, not because Zelensky is ready, but because Russia's momentum has forced the issue.